So we're all going to encounter emotions by being alive, of course, but in this process that we're engaging, this unbinding process, awakening, and the lot, we're going to obviously encounter a lot of emotion. And it's really helpful to know effective ways to work with emotion and how to know when we're bypassing something, how to know at what levels we can work with emotion and what is prudent in given circumstances. So I guess I'll just start by giving my reflection on the way emotions function, what they really are. And I think a simple way of talking about what an emotion is for this context is that an emotion is something between a sensation and a narrative. And it often includes both. It includes sensation and it includes narrative. It also often includes some kind of push or pull. We might consider, well, we do often consider some emotions desirable, enjoyable, helpful, and we consider other emotions unhelpful, undesirable, unenjoyable. And I think as we mature in our practice, in our integration, and in our human development, we start to recognize that that's an unnecessary dichotomy between positive and negative emotions, enjoyable and unenjoyable emotions. Although those qualities can still be there, they tend to soften, and we tend to have a less a managing approach to emotion. Early on, it can seem like we have an ability to choose our emotional states or push emotions away when they're not convenient, etc. And perhaps there is some of that can happen, but ultimately what happens really is just a kind of avoidance, a kind of dissociation. And I think to really get to the heart of how emotions function and how we can work with them intelligently and in a way that feels integrated and aligned is to understand this relationship between avoidance, unconsciousness, emotion, and belief. So, stated simply, I think that it's important because emotions are somewhere in the spectrum of sensation to narrative. I think it's important to work with emotion at different levels. And we may be comfortable, and a given individual may be comfortable at working with emotion at a certain level, but not a different level. Before we wake up, often we experience emotions in a very narrative-based way. We may not really be in touch with the physical experience of emotion. The body may not really emote much as far as tears and really displaying the emotion in and with the body. And we may even be cut off from recognizing when we're feeling strong emotions. We may not even notice it, whereas others around us may notice it. I can think of numerous examples of people describing either themselves or a partner having chronic repressed anger and just feeling it all the time. And maybe they went through a period where they didn't even know or weren't aware of it, but others around them were. Or if you're really close to somebody who has a lot of repressed anger, you just feel it. It's there. And strangely, often it's not completely obvious to the person who's repressing it or has a lot of repressed emotional material or anger and so forth. So this is what I mean. It's that there's something about emotion that we learn at an early age, most of us, probably all of us to some degree, but I think a lot of it is familial. Really depends how well our families or our emotional guides navigated emotion themselves. In my growing up, my family, it was a lot of repression, avoidance, denial of emotion states, strangely. But it wasn't even spoken about in that way. Just a lot of repression. So we all have this inherited emotional landscape from our families and from whatever circumstances we grew up in, but often our parents. And that feels so much like who we are. Feels like, this is why, this is a bit of an aside for this lecture, but this is why identity is key. It's really key to get to the identity structure, to get into deep transformation. But yeah, it feels like who we are, right? It feels like who I am in this body. And that feeling, that sense of me requires some degree of repression, some degree of avoidance. So often it's what we're avoiding is seeing that there is no actual distinct individual there, right? This is deep realization, but that is part of what we're doing all the time. When we feel like a me, we're overlooking something. Because when we see clearly, we see through that. Well, also when we feel separate, when we feel like a me that feels separate, when we feel like a me that is having its own experience or its own internal experience that is separate from others, separate from different environments, and it can navigate and sometimes control those environments or avoid those environments, that whole feeling of me or I, or being a separate self, also requires us to overlook certain things, to, in an ongoing way, overlook the fact that actually there's no personal experience, really. There is to some degree, or in one way of speaking, but not in the way it feels. Like it feels so personal, it feels so isolated, it feels so real, it feels so distinct to be a me apart from a you and apart from an environment or a world. And that entire feeling, we grow up with it, right? Maybe when we're really, really young, we didn't have it. Well, we didn't for sure, but we're also not recording through memory at that age. And those are causally related. So we may have very, very distant kind of memories of this being impersonal, being interconnected, not having boundaries. But as we've developed a sense of self and memories and a life in the conventional way, we've developed this sense of being a me. But it feels like a personal me. It feels personal to you. Everyone's is probably a little bit different, but there's probably a lot more similarity than we realize. And that similarity is what we often hide in social situations or even from our closest friends and family. That is that I feel isolated all the time, that I feel like something's wrong with me, that I feel less than, that I feel like I'm missing out on something, that I feel not okay, right? We hide a lot of that. When we go into therapy or we start doing group relational work, often we start to acknowledge that and even publicly state that, which is in and of itself therapeutic, because at least we're being honest about what's really going on inside. This correlates to what I describe as really the first stage of awakening, which is recognizing that we suffer. And again, there are people who this doesn't really apply to almost anyone here, I don't think, but there are certainly people who will hear, the first noble truth of Buddhism, life is suffering, and go, oh, well, I don't suffer. Maybe some people do, but I don't. And I've heard people say that. I've heard very intelligent people say this, high functioning people say, I don't suffer, right? That simply means that person has not taken a close look at what they take themselves to be. They have to avoid taking a close look at what they take themselves to be to not recognize the suffering, because it's really uncomfortable to be a distinct, separate, suffering, reactive at-risk self all the time. Of course it is, right? So there are layers of identification within thought that can stack one on top of another to make us even forget that we're suffering. So we don't even really take a close look at ourself, at our sense of self that I'm talking about, our feeling of being a me. We don't take a close look at it, right? If we're in a really superficial state of identification with thought. It's something like who I am is really just who I can convince others I am, right? Projection. Constantly maintaining a persona, curating a persona, right? Almost like you would do with a business. Like you have a business, you have your business image or your whatever, and you're maintaining it and curating it and keeping it healthy for others to interface with your business. But we do that with ourself, and we lie about what we're really feeling. We lie about what's going on inside. So I think that's probably a good majority of humans that walk the face of the earth are just doing that. And when you're doing that, when you're curating a persona, curating an image and projecting it outward all the time and spending your energy doing that, you're not introspecting much of the time. So from that place, that's kind of, in my book, I describe this whole cascade of emotional maturity. That's kind of the most superficial level, or one end of that spectrum of emotional connection with ourselves, where we're not even really feeling what we're feeling. We're not even concerned with what we're feeling. I'm only concerned with what I can convince you I am, or I'm feeling, or who I am, or how valuable I am. And you can put so much energy into that, and it's all through thought, that you really are using that, whether you know it or not, to avoid feeling. And I know this from personal experience, of course. So that's one end of the spectrum. That's when we're pretty asleep, and we're asleep to the fact that we're asleep. At some point, we can become at least awake to the fact that we're asleep. That brings people to channels like this, right? Happens all kinds of ways. Happens through a psychedelic experience, happens through disruption or tragedy, happens because you randomly picked up The Power of Now and read it, something clicked, something shifted. Happens all different ways, but that's the first layer of inauthenticity that we start to see through. We're like, oh man, no, I am suffering. And wow, how did I hide that from myself? That's really strange, but I did. I really feel uncomfortable a lot of the time. I feel uncomfortable around people. I feel uncomfortable around people I'm close to. I'm actually projecting a persona and putting energy into that instead of just being authentic. Wow, I can't believe I'm doing this, but I am. And that's good. It's good to get to that layer of that, to notice that first layer of inauthenticity and get down to a little bit more authenticity with how you feel, that you suffer, that things are uncomfortable a lot of the time. Now, some of us are sort of born that way almost, or just grew up feeling that almost all the time. That was me. I don't remember as a child really much happiness, or it just felt uncomfortable all the time. But it was because of that. I was directly in contact with that suffering. And in retrospect, that was grace, but it was really not fun going through it, because I could see that people were faking it. I could see that they were miserable underneath, but they somehow could conveniently overlook that. I couldn't. And the more I was around people, the more I felt what they felt, and the empathy of it, and my own self developing that internal world that was more and more uncomfortable as time went on. It was kind of terrible. So, but again, it's grace when you realize that can lead to awakening, right? So that's the most superficial sort of way we relate to emotion, where we really use our ongoing energy expenditure of the mind to essentially avoid a lot of emotion. Maybe not all emotion, but a lot of it. Once you have that insight, though, that, oh, wow, I've been inauthentic for a long time, and I didn't even know it, right? I was innocently hiding, innocently inauthentic, innocently avoidant of my own emotions. that's great news, because from there, it's really just up to how radical are you willing to be in your own exploration of your internal experience. Like, do you want to wake up? Do you want to do deep, intense, thorough-going emotion work? There's a lot more and more modalities available and groups available, and trauma-informed awake therapists more and more that can help you through this. So there's so much opportunity now for us to address all of this. And that's really all you need. You just need enough insight to realize that fundamental first layer, that superficial first layer of inauthenticity, just seeing through it, seeing that's just a bunch of thoughts. It's a bunch of thoughts and kind of motivations that are based on avoidance. But you can turn that around and say, okay, I don't want to avoid anymore. And, this is different for everyone. Some people ease into it. Sometimes you see it and you're like, okay, I can only do so much right now. I can only, take a little bit of this at a time because it's really hard on the psyche. If you've had a lot of trauma, it can be really hard on, because you're bringing so much trauma up. That avoidant mechanism can actually help mitigate the experience of trauma, keeping it out of consciousness all the time, or most of the time. As my recent interview with Bud Wheeler described, and as James McCleary will say in the Guys in the Work documentary, it's coming out sideways. There are innocent bystanders when you repress anything. You won't see it maybe, but it's there, So yeah, if we bury a lot of pain, repressed emotion, trauma, and so forth, and really lock it away, it doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect. It's just that you're not aware of the effect often on yourself and others. So you're in a good place when you finally realize, okay, I need to be more authentic. I need to dig in more diligently and be willing to see some things I'm probably not going to want to see, and so forth. As my Zen teacher would say, angels could do no more. Once you've broken that spell of inauthenticity and you're like, okay, now I have to look. Sometimes that's all you can really do is just be willing. You're not going to know how to look necessarily. You're not going to maybe even know where to look right away. But something in you knows that this work needs to be done. And I really like in Zen, the Bodhisattva vows, right? Greed, hatred, and ignorance rise endlessly. I vow to abandon them. That's just a reckoning. I mean, that's just recognizing what's already happening. That, yeah, they do rise endlessly. Greed, hatred, ignorance, competitiveness, fear, doubt, all of it. It rises endlessly in the form of thoughts, essentially, and reaction to thoughts. But being willing to do that work is awesome. Like, that's what I respect in people in this space, because without it, there are going to be innocent bystanders, and we are going to continue to repress it. And then our children will repress it, and then their children, and that's been going on for generations. But it's like, at some point you got to say, well, the buck stops here. to the degree I can address it, I want to address it. So then we really start engaging the emotion body. And there's so much variation in how people interface with their emotions. Certainly, some people are more comfortable with certain emotions and less comfortable with others. Some people are much more comfortable with fear and much less comfortable with anger. And I find some people are the opposite. Some people are much more comfortable with anger, not so comfortable with fear. And you can kind of see why, right? These are reaction formations. If I want to avoid fear at all costs, I might become an aggressive, angry person, right? If I want to overcome the possibility of being victimized, I become the victimizer at the extreme, of course. And vice versa. I maybe feel really comfortable with fear, and I may even develop things like habits of people pleasing, right? In all its various forms. There's a lot of ways to do that. There's a lot of ways to disarm people without being aggressive. You can make them laugh. You can be submissive. You can use servitude. All of these things can come into play. And if that's all based in fear, or if it's largely based in fear, then often what we're afraid of is actually stepping into our power. We're stepping into that anger that probably needs to be stepped into to some degree, or at least understood and felt and processed, because anger is about boundaries, right? So we may not have great boundaries if we're too much in the people-pleasing side of things or too much in the fearful side of things. So just understand that, yes, everyone will come into contact with a huge variety of emotions in this process. All of them, right? Fear, anger, frustration, impatience, ecstasy, fear of ecstasy, joy, surprise, shame, guilt, resentment, right? Make a study of it. Notice what you're feeling. Label it if you have to. And notice the cascade. They come in groups sometimes, and sometimes they come kind of randomly, and sometimes it's very calm and there's not a lot of going on in the emotion body. But just being willing to see how much bandwidth you have for emotion and experience in and of itself is very, very powerful. It's huge, actually. Being able to acknowledge that you have the capacity to feel anger, sadness, guilt, shame, helplessness, fear of helplessness, is really good. It's moving toward maturity. Seeing that those emotions aren't going to destroy you. That's critical. This is why we repress. We repress because we're actually afraid of emotion. Sometimes for good reasons when the repression forms, and sometimes for not so good reasons. For instance, a child may learn to repress fear because they're in a dangerous environment and they've learned that showing fear will bring harm to them. Being fearless may get respect from a certain adult or something, right? So we learn to repress, avoid, hide in certain ways, and sometimes it is really adaptive at that age. But because of the way our minds function, we will carry that into adulthood when it's not relevant anymore. So this is why it's important to just get to know yourself in this way, get to know these emotional landscapes, and see that you actually have far more bandwidth than you realized, because you're not a child anymore, and there certainly is a role for fear as an adult, but it's much less common. We're much more likely to learn to just not get ourselves into abusive situations. We sometimes still do, but it's you have a lot more choices than you did as a child, and so you're able to actually say, okay, maybe I can feel this now. I didn't want to feel the fear as a child, but now it's time, and I can, and I have the capacity. And boy, am I afraid to feel fear, but I can go there, and I can touch into it. Maybe with a therapist, maybe with a group you trust, maybe with yourself or a partner. But those explorations are hugely beneficial. Now, I will say, this is a bit of an aside, I will say that when I talk about this stuff, there are inevitably some people who are like, why do you talk about this? I don't want to hear about this. I want to hear about awakening, right? This is part of it. It just is. You may have an awakening without doing any emotion work. You can, for sure. And that's fine. That's great. But you will be called to do the work, certainly after awakening. And if you don't, and you keep overlooking it or bypassing it in whatever way that happens, right? Through habits, through listening to certain teachers that you can conveniently misinterpret that say you don't have to do anything. There's a lot of ways to avoid. But if you avoid this work I'm talking about, you won't know the deep stages of realization. They just won't. They'll just elude you. So that's why I talk about it for anyone that this is, like I said, it's an aside, but I've just heard this enough times. Often in retrospect, people will tell me, God, I really didn't like when you talked about shadow work. I didn't get it. I didn't understand it. And then they go through some deep shadow stuff themselves. Often they're forced into it by life circumstances a couple years later. And then they realize, oh, okay, now I can see why the deeper realization was eluding me, right? Why? The simple answer is what I was mentioning before, that if you don't recognize and utilize your wide bandwidth of emotional experience, then you won't recognize and utilize your wide bandwidth of energetic experience. And this is all energetic. Awakening feels like it's at the level of mind with the first shift, or it can. But usually with a deep shift, you touch into the energetics as well. But in deeper realization, it's all energetics. It's not about thoughts or beliefs, it's energetic. right? And if there's an energetic holding, a fixation rooted in maybe one emotion you just don't want to feel, or a trauma you don't want to touch, or whatever, then the subtler aspects of realization will definitely elude you. And there's nothing fundamental about you or anyone that makes that makes it so that you can't touch into something. It's really just a habit. It's a habit of avoidance. Anyone can reverse a habit of avoidance, but you have to be willing to. And to be willing to do that, you have to be willing to be uncomfortable. Right? As I kind of start out in my book, I spend my almost entire first chapter with like cautions and warnings. But it's not just to warn people, it's really to get you prepared for the fact that you're going to experience a lot of things you didn't know you were going to experience, that you didn't know you could experience. And that's great, you know, but some of it's going to be what you didn't want to experience. So just know that this realization process will take you to places you didn't expect. You know, I know I'm preaching to the choir with most of the people listening here, but there are certainly people who, you know, still are trying to negotiate. You can't negotiate with reality. Don't do it. Right? It's too powerful. It's too, it knows you too well. It knows you better than yourself. It knows that you do have this tremendous capacity for experience, and it's going to show you that. And you won't like it necessarily, but it's going to show you. So this is why I often suggest these open-ended kinds of questions for this type of work. They sound broad or sort of maybe even vague, but the reason is they're open-ended to allow you to touch into part of this bandwidth that you may have avoided for a while. For a while, meaning since you were 18 months old. You didn't avoid it before that because you couldn't. So an open-ended question is just that. It's open. And it's open to possibilities that you may not consider even part of yourself. So things like, what am I avoiding? What am I not wanting to accept? I'll throw a bunch of these questions out, but you only need one. If one clicks for you, ask it. And keep asking it till you get an answer. What do I not want to feel? What do I not want to see? Now, sometimes when you ask a question like, what do I not want to feel, or what am I avoiding, you'll immediately feel it. It'll come like a wave. A wave of sensation, emotion, fear. I've had this happen many times where I'm working with somebody and I ask them the question and then they immediately feel it. So just know that can happen, but it doesn't always. Sometimes it's like vague, right? If there's a lot of repression, a lot of chronic repression of a certain emotion, maybe something vague, like, you know, fear is on a spectrum. There's terror, and then there's like, you know, angst and anxiety, and then there's, I don't know, like trepidation or worry, you know, it comes in all kinds of varieties, but some of them are far more subtle. So you may get something like that. And what am I not wanting to feel? And you just feel a little bit of tension, maybe. You can ask, what is this? What emotion is this? See if it gets bigger. See if it gets more intense. Or just see if it feels like it suddenly takes up more of your body. What am I not wanting to feel? And when something comes, a little bit of tension, maybe you find it directly in the body. Oh, like I feel it in my left calf. You might find something like that, so don't be surprised. I feel it in my left hand. Feel it in the side of my face. Then that's a sign. That's telling you something often. What do I not want to feel? Go right to it. And then ask it, what are you? Or what emotion is this? See what happens to the body. You can also ask it, What do you want to show me? Because sometimes what happens is we mark avoidance patterns with sensations. They're like placeholders. So the sensation isn't necessarily the emotion, but it's the reminder to bury the emotion. So you can just ask, what's underneath this? If you get a tension in the gut or something, what's underneath this? I will say, as I mentioned before, that sometimes something really big comes when you do this. So, do this in a space where you have some time to process it. Don't do it while you're driving, maybe. Don't do it while you're at work. Do it when you're meditating. Do it when you have a weekend. Do it when you're on retreat. And you have the capacity for it. Sometimes people will say, oh, it's too much. It could be overwhelming for you. You won't be able to handle it. You can handle it. It won't come if you can't handle it. But if you have had a lot of trauma and instability in life, you do want to go gentle with this. Don't push too hard. Just ask. See what comes and ask, is that enough for now? And it may just be a sensation, maybe some fear. That's okay. You don't need to push it too hard. But like I said, give yourself a little space and time to process this stuff. If you ask questions like, what's below that sensation, you might be really surprised. So that's the kind of just like a direct breaking into what's happening, like to really just let it come through. May or may not happen for you in that way, in a dramatic way, but it can sometimes. So that's one approach for sure. The other approach is really similar to what I was describing in guided meditation this morning, and that's a somatic approach, directly in the sensations in the body, not trying to dig beyond them, but actually just feeling into them as deeply as you can. And one key to this is, as I described in the meditation, is giving it a lot of space in which to unfold itself or to open itself. And that is by starting by reminding yourself of the entire sensation field of the body. Right? If you recognize how much sensation there actually is, you can scan the body. You can do it toes, calves, knees, thighs, pelvis, belly, chest, shoulders, arms, hands, neck, head, face. You can remind yourself of all these spaces. Or once you're more accustomed to it, you probably can just take it all in at once, the whole entire sensation field of the body. And it'll feel rather alive, may feel tingly, may feel really sort of deep and peaceful. It may not. It may feel like some tension. But just keeping some attention in the entirety of that sensation field tends to help balance the energies when you start to settle into a contracted energy. Like I said before, if you ask a question like, what am I not wanting to feel? What am I avoiding? You may just notice something light up in the body. Might be in a chakra, might be in your shoulder. So in this way, we're not trying to dig deeper into it or anything. We're just feeling. We're feeling right where it is. And just putting our attention into the sensation. It helps if we can sort of, I guess one question that does help to dial into it. It's not really trying to see what is beyond it or beneath it, but it's just trying to dial into it in a more intimate way. Is you can sort of ask, what does it feel like from inside the sensation? Right? Because often if we sort of map the entire body somehow with a sensation field, and then we notice one chakra, like the heart chakra, there's a perception that it's one part of the whole, right? It's in a certain place in the body. But if we're able to ask, okay, well, what does it feel like from inside the heart chakra right now? You may have a little bit more intimacy with it. You're not looking at it from like a space of awareness or from something bigger. You're experiencing it from its own side, from its own place. And just resting in that is valuable. That's a more meditative approach or a meditative practice where you're not really digging further. You're just in feeling and acceptance mode and noticing how it correlates with the wider sense of the body. Because one way or another, when there's something that feels contracted, distinct, cut off, stuck, there's a sensational component to it, meaning something in the way the body is perceiving sensation will feel demarcated. It will feel disconnected somehow. So keeping some attention in the entirety of the sensation field while we explore the sensation of contraction or stuckness or a center from its own inside will often start to dissolve the distinction between the contraction and the kind of expanded experience of body sensation. This is also a sort of non-dual approach as well in the body field, recognizing there's no boundary anywhere. This tends to be a much softer approach than what I described at first. Then there's relational work, which I've been incorporating more of, working with James McCleary and the Inside Circle group that are coming to the retreat in May, because relational work is, if it's done right and it's done with the right people, with the right experience and the ability to really get down into the emotion body in a safe way, in a safe container, it's maybe the best approach to emotion work I've seen. But and the caveat is there are many, many relational groups that don't actually do that. And there's some that are even really dysfunctional. So you have to choose wisely, I suppose, the group you're in. But that kind of relational work can really be good at addressing emotions, working with emotions, processing emotions, understanding emotions, and most importantly, bringing something out of the experience that's utility for you, and perhaps as importantly or more importantly for the world, right? So that kind of work I find really, really helpful in traversing the shadow is relational work with people who are good at it. And it's the kind of I think it's the best in one sense, the best at just addressing the emotions on their own terms, on their own ground, without trying to deconstruct it into a sensation and a belief and so forth. You don't have to do that. You don't have to necessarily do that kind of work, but I do think it's pretty valuable, and it really addresses what some people tend to overlook and bypass with spiritual work. So there is relational work. I'm not going to go into detail on that. I have videos and interviews, and you can come to the retreats, and I'll. My favorite documentary that I always mention is The Work, and you can check that out. But then there's the approach of belief, looking at beliefs. And I think this is probably ultimately the most important aspect of this work, because belief is very intertwined with resistance. Belief is very intertwined with hiding, with avoidance. The difference between a hidden belief, a belief that you hold and you move through the world as if it's true, but are not aware of, right? A hidden belief. The difference between a hidden belief and a belief revealed is like the difference between heaven and hell. Some of the biggest shifts, some of the biggest transformations come when we see through a very fundamental belief. And 95% of that is just seeing that we actually hold the belief in the first place. Right? And those correlate very directly with awakening. They correlate very directly with awakening insights. like the belief that I am separate. That underpins so much. Now, as I mentioned before, you have to do some shadow work. You can't really just get directly to that belief from what I've seen. Maybe serendipitously, or if you have extremely good karma or something, the rare person might, without having to do super intense shadow work, be able to just undermine the belief that I am separate and suddenly realize non-dual and live that way and whatever. But it underpins so many other beliefs and other delusions, right? That I'm separate from everything and everyone. It underpins all the beliefs we may have about having to be competitive, about being harmed by others, about being a victim, about being a victimizer. It underpins beliefs about that they come in the form of resentment, guilt, shame. So many of those are related to the fundamental belief that I am separate. Separate from you, separate from everyone, separate from my partner, separate from my parents, separate from my children, separate from objects in the world. Implicit in that belief is struggle. Implicit in that belief is incompleteness. Implicit in that belief is isolation, loneliness, helplessness. Helplessness is a funny one in that, not haha funny, more like existentially funny, I suppose. But I mentioned in my book that at the bottom of these cascades of emotions, we often find helplessness. But the reason I say it's funny in the sense that helplessness from the standpoint and view of a separate individual is worst possible situation, right? It's terrifying. But helplessness, when the view is corrected, the view of separation is corrected, and we see the proper view, which is non-separation, there's a kind of helplessness that arises from that is so innocent and sweet. It's the helplessness of animals, and we see that we are also just like that. It's the helplessness of not being in control of anything and never having really wanted that illusion of control. It's a very wonderful helplessness. But again, it really hinges on that very fundamental belief we have that I am, right? I am something, I am someone apart, which comes with it so much fear and discontent and suffering. But luckily, it comes with suffering because suffering itself is the cure. Suffering itself is the way. It's the conduit. It's the catalyst. It's the first noble truth. So how does suffering relate to emotion work? This is a really interesting one because I almost want to encourage you to hold on to a little bit of suffering. Because the more you understand what it is, the more you see what it's doing, the more gratitude you have for the fact that it was here. Suffering kind of says, and it's not okay. Whatever's happening, and it's not okay. Fear, and it's not okay. Anger, and it's not okay. Helplessness, and it's not okay, right? So it's a question. Is it okay? Why is it not okay? Why is it not okay to feel? Why is it not okay to feel sad? Why is it not okay to touch trauma? What is it in us that believes it's not okay? Right? Because everything we come into contact with, sooner or later we realize it is okay. Sensation's okay. Sadness is okay. Grief is okay. Fear is okay. Pain is okay. Because it just is. Right? So where does the not okay come from? It's to give away the last chapter, it doesn't actually exist, right? Suffering strangely doesn't actually exist, but the residue of avoidance, resistance, and so forth will come in the form of suffering. So it's always compelling us to look closer. It's always compelling us to look closer. That's why this whole thing hinges on suffering. There's curiosity, sure. There's a desire or drive to live one's true nature, sure. There's a drive to clarify that experience of oneness I had when I took a bunch of mushrooms. Sure, all that's true. But underneath all of it, the simple statement in Buddhism, samsara is nirvana, is completely accurate. It's driving this whole thing. So when we can finally have gratitude for our own suffering, that's deep spiritual maturity. I trust that person. I trust their realization at that point. When you really know what it means that suffering is liberation. It's not the path to liberation. It is liberation. Now, that will never be understood from the standpoint of a self. So that fundamental view has to go before this will become clear. But what a great koan to take up. What a great challenge to take up for ourselves. To see what is suffering and what is emotion. What is suffering and what is sadness? What is suffering and what is grief? What is suffering and what is anxiety? They're not the same. One simply is. It's just inexperience. Whatever is inexperience already is. It's not a problem. So what's the suffering about? The suffering is just saying, look closer. Look closer. Feel more closely. Feel more fully. Look closer at the implications of non-duality. Adyashanti dropped a really beautiful challenge that is part of why I do what I do. He said, you've realized that you're not separate. Now you're going to live that way. How are you going to live that way? That's a challenge that you can take up and work on the rest of your life. Right? Look closer at that. Look closer at what it really, the implications of being awake to the fact that you are not separate. Nothing is separate. There is no separation. There is no form. Just luminous appearance. How are you going to live it? Look closer. Look closer. Look closer. Don't try to end your own suffering. I mean, yeah, for First Awakening, that's a really, really good motivation. And it will take care of a lot of your suffering. And as you do shadow work, it will take care of a lot more of your suffering. But there's a little residue left. At some point, the realization will go beyond your own drive to end your own suffering. It has to. Nisargadatta said, if you regress properly, the I am sense will disappear. This is true. I'd say if you regress properly, compassion will outstrip any self-interest to end your own suffering. It's a moot point at some point. Sometimes people will go, do you suffer anymore? Did your suffering end? And my inclination is like, who cares? That's not what I'm worried about. I'm not concerned about that at all. It's not of concern. So yes, this whole thing starts and propagates through our wanting to end our own suffering, to know our own true nature, which are the same thing. But things get so paradoxical that it gets indescribable. But these little pointers are helpful, these little breadcrumbs, like samsara is nirvana. Like you've realized non-duality, now how are you going to live? How are you going to live that? Not through the mind, not through your mind tells you. Your mind will be like, oh, you got to be a spiritual teacher and get some robes and some beads and blah, 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 act enlightened. That's your mind. How are you going to move through the world? How are you going to take the next step? How are you going to lift the fork to your mouth? Right? That's the challenge, an every minute challenge, the challenge of every minute Zen. How are you going to regard that emotion that's there right now? Do you need to do some work on it? Do you need to get rid of it? Is it a problem? Is it a lesson? Is it separate? Is there suffering in addition? Like, look closely. This is all about clear seeing, looking more and more and more closely. And suffering is our greatest gift because it will always tell you to look more closely. After that first recognition, the recognition of, like I mentioned at the very beginning, it's time to be authentic. And everyone here is beyond that. So it's really just, okay, thank you. Show me where to look now. Thank you. Thank you, suffering. Show me where to look. It'll show you. It'll show you everything. Okay, that's all.